The seeds of the cheese war of the Pacific were sown amid the windswept plateaus and mineral-rich deserts of South America as Pacific Coast in the mid-19th century. After gaining independence from Spain, Chile, Peru, and Bolivia struggled to define borders and control resources. In particular, the Atacama Desert, stretching north from Chile into Bolivian territory, harbored vast deposits of sodium nitrate, white gold, a valuable fertilizer and explosive ingredient in growing global demand. Chilean, Bolivian, and British entrepreneurs vied to develop the nitrate fields, forging complex concessions and tax agreements that masked festering tensions. By the 1870s, Bolivia, landlocked and eager to bolster state revenues, imposed a new export tax on nitrate production in the coastal province of Antofagasta, a region administered under the 1866 boundary treaty that set the border at the 24 South parallel. The tax directly violated a 10-year Chilean exemption clause in the 1874 treaty, agreed to by both nations to encourage foreign investment. Chilean companies protested vigorously, backed by their government's diplomatic protests in Sucre. Bolivia, desperate for funds and distrustful of Chile's rising power, refused to back down. Meanwhile, Peru watched anxiously. Although Peru and Chile had amicable relations, and Peru itself was a leading nitrate producer, the Lima government had secretly signed a defensive alliance with Bolivia in 1873. Drawn by shared fears of Chilean expansionism and British economic influence, Peruvian politicians believed a pact would deter unilateral Bolivian concessions to Chilean interests. Crucially, that secret treaty obliged Peru to come to Bolivia's aid in the event of aggression. Yet Peru's elites wrestled with the dilemma of honoring a covert military pact at the risk of war with Chile, upon whose markets and ports much of Peru's exports depended. On February 14, 1879, Bolivia's President Hilarion Daza ordered the seizure and auction of the Antofagasta nitrate and railway company's assets after the Chilean firm refused to pay the disputed tax. Bolivian authorities deported the company's leaders, raised the Bolivian flag over the port, and confiscated rolling stock. Chile immediately labeled the act a violation of international law and mobilized forces under General Erasmo Escala. A Chilean naval squadron appeared off Antofagasta's harbor on February 17th, demanding restoration of the company's rights. Bolivian garrisons, poorly supplied and wary of firing the first shot, evacuated the town without resistance, scuttling 3 naval guns into the bay as they withdrew. By February 28th, Chilean troops had disembarked and formally occupied Antofagasta. Bolivia's appeals to Peru activated their secret alliance. Peru, as ambassador in Santiago, demanded Chile demobilize within 24 hours or face war. Chile, however, refused to negotiate under duress. Diplomatic ties splintered. And on March 5th, Chilean President Aníbal Pinto declared war on Bolivia. 2 days later, Peru presented Chile with an ultimatum to stay neutral. Chile rejected it on March 14th, accusing Peru of collusion. Peru then declared war on Chile on April 5th, cementing the three-way conflict. Within weeks, Chilean forces secured naval dominance, a critical advantage in the nitrate-rich littoral. Under Commodore Juan Williams Rebolledo, the Chilean Navy blocked Peruvian ports, cut supply lines, and prepared for amphibious landings. Bolivia, deprived of a seaport, could only assist through the Altiplano with limited cavalry and artillery units. Meanwhile, Peru fortified its coastline at ports like Iquique and Pisagua, rallying troops for defense. as April gave way to May 1879. The great contest for South America's saltpeter coast ignited in earnest. Beneath the blistering sun and amid sands that would itself become an enduring witness, three nations marched toward the first pitched battles of a war that would reshape borders, economies, and national identities across the Pacific shore. As April turned to May 1879, the War of the Pacific entered its second act on both sea and land. Peru's recently acquired ironclad Huáscar and its wooden corvette Independencia prowled the Pacific coast, determined to break Chile's nascent blockade. On May 1st, the two Peruvian vessels encountered the Chilean corvette Esmeralda and the schooner Covadonga off the port of Iquique. Captain Arturo Prat aboard the Esmeralda, adhering to an austere code of honor, closed with the Huáscar despite the ironclad's heavier guns and armor. In a brief but dramatic exchange of broadsides, Prat and several officers fell when Esmeralda's deck was raked by Huáscar's 300-pounder shell. Yet the wood and iron Esmeralda refused to yield. As the ship circled, Chilean crewmen scrambled aboard the Huáscar in a desperate boarding action. Though repulsed, their valor became legendary in Chilean lore. Meanwhile, Covadonga, commanded by Captain Carlos Condal, lured the Independencia toward the shallow waters near Punta Gruesa. There, the Peruvian ironclad struck an uncharted rock and sank, depriving Peru of one of its few modern warships. The Battle of Iquique and Punta Gruesa on May 21st thus produced a mixed result: tactical defeat and heroic martyrdom for Chile, strategic loss of a ship for Peru, and a naval war that would hinge on the Huáscar's elusive raids along the coast. With the Chilean Navy controlling the high seas, attention shifted to the vital transports and amphibious landings that would decide the war's overland phase. On November 2, 1879, under the command of General Erasmo Escala, a Chilean expeditionary force of nearly 10,000 troops sailed southward from Antofagasta. At dawn on November 18th, the transport fleet approached the wide, sweeping bay of Pisagua, a dusty port nestled between towering cliffs and the endless Pacific. Defending the town were elements of Peru's Second Corps and bolstered Bolivian mountain battalions, crouched behind hastily erected earthen redoubts. As the first landing boats bumped against the rocky shoreline, Chilean sharpshooters opened fire from concealed skiffs, covering the disembarkation of the main columns. Artillery batteries aboard the corvettes blasted the rebel works with shattering volleys, while infantry companies waited ashore under heavy fire. By midday, despite fierce resistance and the loss of hundreds of men in the surf, Chile's veteran regiments had seized the high ground. With their flanks turned and their positions untenable, the Peruvians and Bolivians withdrew in disorder toward the Andean frontier, leaving Pisagua to Chilean control. Buoyed by this success, Chilean forces advanced inland to the desert town of Dolores, also known as San Francisco, where they sought to cut the nascent Allied supply lines. On November 19th, General Manuel Baquedano assembled his division at the base of the barren hills overlooking the oasis. Opposing them were the Peruvian Northern Army under Colonel Justo Pastor de Villa and Bolivia's Valdivia Division, numbering together some 8,000 men. In the pre-dawn gloom of November 19th, Chilean engineers silently cut the barbed wire entanglements protecting the Allied trenches. At first light, the bugle sounded and columns rose from cover. With drums beating and banners unfurled, Chile's troops surged forward across the ochre sands. The Andean defenders braced behind ridges of packed earth, delivering disciplined volleys as the attackers crested each dune. Fierce hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the gullies, bayonet against bayonet, as Chileans poured through breaches. After hours of savage combat, a Chilean flanking column swept around the enemy's left, rolling up remaining positions and capturing dozens of artillery pieces. The Allies, their cohesion shattered and ammunition nearly spent, fell back in disarray toward the inhospitable Altiplano. Chilean cavalry pursued lightly, but the harsh desert heat and lack of forage forced a halt. By nightfall, the Battle of Dolores, later dubbed San Francisco, had ended in a decisive Chilean victory, with some 2,000 Allied casualties and hundreds taken prisoner. Chilean losses, though significant, were borne with grim satisfaction. The road to the Tarapacá nitrate fields lay open. These twin triumphs at Pisagua and Dolores cemented Chile's reputation for naval mastery and battlefieldosity. Yet the campaign had only just begun. In the weeks that followed, the Allied governments in Lima and La Paz would dispatch new forces across the desolate highlands. Hopes of a turning tide rested on the legendary exploits of the Huáscar and the untested valor of poorly supplied mountain infantry. As December dawned, the desert sands still held. Their secrets that Chilean and Allied soldiers alike would uncover at a terrible cost in the battles yet to come. With the road to the Tarapacá nitrate fields now open, Chilean commanders pressed their advantage into the inhospitable desert interior. Supply lines, however, proved perilously stretched. Overland convoys laden with ammunition, food, and water crawled along rough camel trails from the coast, vulnerable to sandstorms and ambush. Meanwhile, Allied forces under Colonel Justo Pastor de Villa, Peru, and General Campero, Bolivia, began to coalesce in the town of Tarapacá, determined to turn the tide in defense of their economic heartland. In late November 1879, Chile SI Division under General Patricio Lynch moved northward from Dolores toward the oasis of Pampa Germania, encountering sporadic resistance from Bolivian cavalry patrols. A crippling desert gale struck on November 25th, shrouding columns and choking dust and disorienting mule drivers. More than once, entire wagons careened off narrow cliff tracks. Lost scouts wandered until rescued by screaming desert winds. When Chileans finally sighted the faint outline of Tarapacá's adobe walls, their numbers were thinned by heat exhaustion and dysentery. Yet morale remained bolstered by the promise of rich nitrate works and the conviction that victory would soon be theirs. On the morning of November 27th, Lynch deployed his brigades in an arc around the town, aiming to envelop the Allied defenders. De Villa, forewarned by local sympathizers, had entrenched Peruvian infantry atop low ridges south of Tarapacá, supported by Bolivian artillery placed along the riverbed. The terrain was unforgiving. Fields of jagged volcanic rock offered scant cover, while the desert sun beat mercilessly on men and guns alike. Chilean engineers spent the night probing for gaps in the Allied wire and stockade, a ramshackle barrier of thorn bushes and cactus stalks. At dawn, Chile's De Angelis Brigade crept forward under covering fire from Maxim machine guns, cutting wires as mortar teams lobbed shells into bunkers. Peruvian sharpshooters answered with accurate volleys, but Chilean surge columns pressed through, driving trench-to-trench fighting across the arid plain. Bolivian cavalry charged to stem the breach, only to be met by disciplined Chilean infantry squares bristling with bayonets. Horses faltered on the hot sand. Many fell under the dual hail of bullets and steel. By mid-morning, Chilean flanking units under Colonel Ordonez had skirted the Allied right, threatening to sever their withdrawal route toward Paginals. Davila ordered an orderly retreat, but poor coordination and panic set in. Peruvian units collided in desert ravines, guns were abandoned, and stragglers were picked off by mounted Chilean dragoons. More than 3,500 Allied troops were killed, wounded, or captured. Chilean losses totaled roughly 1,300, but included several prominent officers whose leadership inspired them onward. The Battle of Tarapacá thus cemented Chile's control of the desert, though at the cost of a campaign that would test human endurance to its limit. Beyond Tarapacá, Chilean forces paused to reorganize. The long, thin supply chain from Pisagua to Pampa Germania was burdened by so many casualties and stockpiled water that General Baquedano contemplated a risky railroad extension. Meanwhile, Peru's commander-in-chief, General Juan Bundia, began to gather reinforcements from the southern highlands, while President Nicolas de Pirola strove to procure additional arms from Europe. Bolivia, deprived of a coastline, struggled to equip troops overland through Argentine territory, a logistical labyrinth that yielded too few muskets and artillery. In early 1880, both armies prepared for what would be the campaign's decisive engagements: the subsequent advance inland toward the Andean Plateau and the mountain strongholds at Huamachuco and Arica. But before these could unfold, one final series of desert skirmishes would test the limits of leadership and sacrifice. On January 14, 1880, a Chilean cavalry patrol under Lieutenant Colonel Lizardo Montero encountered a Peruvian raiding party near the salt flats of Carangas. Fueled by nationalist fervor, Peruvian lancers sought to disrupt Chilean foraging parties, hoping to ignite a broader insurgency among local oasis dwellers. The clash was brief but brutal. Sabers flashed, carbines cracked, and the stench of gunpowder hung over broken salt crust. Montero's dragoons routed the raiders, capturing their standards and scattering survivors into the wastes. Though inconsequential in scale, the engagement underscored the war as attritional nature, a conflict fought as much by small detachments against the elements as by grand armies on the battlefield. By February, Chilean command had established forward supply depots at Agua Santa and Tarata, enabling sustained operations toward the Bolivian frontier. General Baquedano, now commanding the entire expeditionary force, issued a rare proclamation praising the courage of the common soldier who marched without relief through desert and storm. Yet whispers of mutiny surfaced as troops went unpaid and malaria struck down sentries in the oasis camps. Baquedano quelled unrest with promises of land grants in conquered territories, a hamde gogigoris, potent incentive for Chilean veterans whose fortunes hung on victory. In Lima, de Pirola's government teetered under economic strain. International loans dried up, and foreign investors balked at financing a war with uncertain prospects. Peru's navy, still operating the formidable Huáscar under Admiral Miguel Grau, conducted daring raids on Chilean transports off Antofagasta. On March 7, 1880, Admiral Grau intercepted a convoy of 3 Chilean schooners laden with military supplies. In a masterful gambit, he closed to point-blank range, unleashing furious broadsides that sank 2 transports and set the third ablaze. The action, later lauded as the naval campaign of Gray, rekindled Peruvian morale and forced Chile to divert scarce naval assets to protect its coastal arteries. But naval exploits could not forestall Chile's looming thrust into the Andean highlands. As March waned, both sides braced for the battles that would determine sovereignty over the rich Altiplano region and, Ultimately, the fate of the nitrate fields themselves. The dawn of April 1880 found Chilean forces poised for the war's final and most arduous theater, the Andean highlands. Under General Manuel Baquedano's resolute command, the Army of the South, comprising seasoned infantry, cavalry detachments, and engineers, marched toward the twin targets of Tacna and Arica, fortified Peruvian toeholds that stood astride the route to Lima. Meanwhile, Bolivia, effectively sidelined after losing its coastal province, offered token support through irregular units and diplomatic pressure, but its role in the coming battles would be minimal. By May, Chilean columns had reached the plateau plain of Alto de la Alianza, some 20 kilometers east of Tacna. On May 26th, the largest infantry engagement of the war unfolded. Baquedano arrayed his division with artillery batteries on the flanks and cavalry held in reserve behind the center. Opposing them, General Narciso Campero commanded the Peruvian and Bolivian Allied Army. Its troops dug into rocky ridges against a backdrop of stark blue sky. At 10 m.m., Chilean guns opened fire with shrapnel shells that tore through Allied earthworks. Under covering volleys, Chilean line infantry advanced across 500 meters of exposed ground, the desert sun reflecting off rifled barrels and bayonet points. Allied defenders replied with disciplined musket volleys and counter-battery fire. Peruvian Lancer squadrons charged Baquedano's left, but Chilean dragoons wheeled to intercept, unleashing carbine salvos that cut into the horsemen. As the afternoon wore on, Chilean engineers exploited gaps in the Allied front, leading sapper teams to breach the thorny wire barricades. Chile's Granaderos Brigade surged through the breach, engaging in ferocious hand-to-hand combat on the rocky slopes. By dusk, the Allied line buckled. Campero ordered a withdrawal toward Tacna town. The next morning, Tacna fell without further contest. Chilean troops occupied the adobe-lined streets, raising their worn flag over the church tower. Peruvian and Bolivian casualties at Alto de la Alianza totaled some 4,000 killed, wounded, or captured. With Tacna secured, Chile's gaze turned to the fortress port of Arica, perched on the Pacific coast yet defended by high cliffs and stout fortifications. By July, the Chilean Expeditionary Corps, reinforced with fresh regiments and engineers, arrived in Arica Bay. Admiral Juan José Latorre's fleet bombarded coastal batteries daily, while ground forces prepared assault plans. On June 7th, the naval bombardment reached its crescendo. Ironclads and monitors pummeled Fort Santa Rosa and San Jose with 300-pounder shells, silencing much of the enemy artillery. At dawn on June 7th, Chile's naval tradition of launching amphibious landings, the assault began. The 1st Division, led by Colonel Emilio Sotomayor, advanced up narrow ravines under covering fire from Maxim guns. Steep cliffs bristled with defenders equipped with Krupp rifles and mountain guns. Chilean pioneers used scaling ladders to surmount rocky outcrops, emerging into close-quarter fighting on Arica's plateau. Meanwhile, a faint landing drew Peruvian reserves toward the beach, thinning the plateau defenses. Within 2 hours, Chilean storming parties reached the summit, engaging in brutal combat amid shattered adobe casemates. Shouts, rifle cracks, and the clang of steel bayonets echoed across the heights. By mid-morning, Chile's flag flew over the fortress's main bastion. The capture of Arica cost Chile roughly 1,500 casualties. Peruvian defenders suffered an estimated 2,000 killed or wounded. The brilliant success at Arica, immortalized by daring Carnales' bayonet charges, marked the end of major hostilities on the coast. With Arica subdued, Chilean command contemplated the final push on Lima. However, high-level politics and international pressure intervened. In Lima, President Francisco Garcia Calderon, installed under Peruvian congressional decree, refused to capitulate despite the Allies' dire situation. U.S. and European diplomats sought to broker peace. Wary of escalating destruction and concerned for merchant interests, negotiations opened in late July at Arica town, attended by Chilean plenipotentiary Benjamin Vicuna McKenna and Peruvian envoys. Chile's terms were stringent: cession of Tarapacá to Chile, foreign administration of Tacna and Arica for 10 years pending plebiscites, and full payment of war indemnities. Peruans balked at ceding their heartland, prolonging talks. Meanwhile, underground resistance simmered across Andean villages, with guerrilla bands ambushing Chilean supply columns. Although these raids, led by hands like Juan Luis Arteaga, harassed occupation forces, they lacked sufficient arms and coordination to pose a strategic threat. By October 20th, 1883, weary of protracted diplomacy and facing domestic unrest in Santiago over the war's cost, Chilean President Domingo Santa Maria signed the Treaty of Ancon with Peru. Peru formally ceded Tarapacá and agreed that Tacna and Arica would remain under Chilean control pending a future vote. Bolivia, excluded from negotiations, had to accept Chilean sovereignty over Antofagasta, a humiliating outcome that severed its Pacific access forever. The War of the Pacific thus drew to a close after over 4 years of grueling desert campaigns, naval duels, and highland battles. Chile emerged territorially expanded and flush with nitrate revenues, propelling an era of economic growth. Peru and Bolivia faced political turmoil and economic hardship, their national psyches scarred by loss. Across the Pacific coast, the sands and peaks still bore silent witness to sacrifice, an indelible testament to a conflict that reshaped nations and realities in the arid margins of South America.